Hi everyone, my name is Brianna, and I will be discussing constructed languages and how they bring language communities together. I'm probably one of the only, if not, you know, one of the few peers in your class who chose to do this YouTube type of presentation. So I do just have a few disclaimers before I get into my research. One, I am not a YouTuber or a video editor, so this video is coming straight off the top of my head, so please bear with me. Two, I will probably butcher the names of these constructed languages. And three, this is not my completed research. I do still have some unanswered questions, and I'll probably reorganize my paper as well. I don't know. So my motivation for, studying constructed languages, I think probably a week or so before we had to come up with our paper topics, I actually ended up watching Avatar. And I was really fascinated by the language, the Navi language that's used in the movie. Um, I know that it's a completely fictional language, and I was just kind of curious, like, how are these like made up languages formed? How they come about? Or are they just gibberish that somebody randomly put together? I didn't really understand constructed languages at all, really. I am, however, familiar with a few examples of constructed languages. Growing up, I really loved to play The Sims, and they have the language Simlish. I am an avid watcher of Game of Thrones, where there is the Dothraki language and High Valyrian language. Also, just some examples from our pop culture, we have Minionese with the Minions. We have Klingon with Star Trek. We have the different Elvish languages that are used in the Lord of the Rings movies, and there are tons of examples of constructed languages in fiction and in TV and movies. So I guess for me, I just really kind of got fascinated by seeing an example of a constructed language, and I just kind of wanted to know more about them. So I guess let's get into it. What exactly is a constructed language? And I do have my notes here. I will be flipping through the pages, so like I said, just bear with me. So according to Stephen Rogers in his book The Dictionary of Made Up Languages, a constructed language is a language that someone invents rather than one that arises naturally in the real world. Pretty simple. So, in a summation, constructed languages are languages that are made up. Okay. A little brief history about constructed languages. The concept of constructed languages can be traced back as far as the ancient Greeks. So, constructed languages have probably been around just as long as language has itself. The earliest example of a recorded constructed language is from Hildegard von Bingen. Um, According to David Peterson, who is actually the creator of the Dothraki language in Game of Thrones, he writes in his book, The Art of Language Invention, that the earliest record we have of a consciously constructed language is from Hildegard von Bingen's Lingua Ignota, which is Latin for unknown language. It was developed sometime around the 12th century CE. The language itself wasn't really a language, but it was really more so like a vocabulary list that included like thousands of nouns. Hildegard developed a language for use in song, dropping lingua ignota words into Latin sentences for presumably a specific kind of religio aesthetic effect. The inspiration for Hildegard's creation came, she believed, from God directly. But pretty much during that time period, the creation of languages was pretty much only for external and supernatural purposes. As far as we know, there has not been, at that time period, any other language that was created for a different purpose. Next in our timeline, we have philosophical languages, which kind of developed around between the 16th century, between like maybe the 18th century. So philosophical languages are languages that wanted to arrange all human knowledge into hierarchies. Philosophical languages were kind of invented to be the language of scholars. It was kind of like a universal language that scholars could use aside from Latin that kind of just discussed the universal concepts in the world. Um, there is an example from John Wilkins, um, who had a pretty well known um, philosophical language. Next in our timeline, we have international auxiliary languages. Um, so, international auxiliary languages are, according to David Peterson once again, an international auxiliary language, by contrast, is created to be as simple to learn and use as possible, so that it can be learned and used by large numbers of people across the world, those who would otherwise share no common language. So this is kind of your first step into a universal language. For short, international auxiliary languages, IALs, were pretty much used to be the common language that, was neutral in politics. It didn't really have a culture associated with it. It was going to be a language that, anybody could use, and it was pretty simple to learn. Some of the first examples of an international auxiliary language are, bear with me. All right, so one example is called, and I'm going to butcher it, it's called Volapük, which is the first, Volapük? The first Conlang to acquire a fluent speaker community. And then a little bit later after that, you have Esperanto, which is a very widely spoken constructed language, and it's actually still spoken today. These IALs were pretty much introduced around the 19th century, when the world is pretty divided and, as a means to communicate with all speakers, linguists and language makers wanted to create a language that could be used by virtually anyone. And then that leads us into the 20th century, where we have artistic languages, where basically creators made up languages, as a source of creativity. One of the most popular artistic languages to exist is from J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the creator of the Elvish languages in your movies like The Hobbit, or the books The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, those series. That language is very much still spoken today and has a very wide fan following. So another question that I had about constructed languages is, why do constructed languages exist? And once again, according to Stephen Rogers in his Dictionary of Made-Up Languages, people invent languages for many reasons: to give themselves and others a challenge, to give depth to a fictional civilization, to explore ideas such as how a society might be if the native tongue contained no words having to do with time. It offers people an auxiliary language that is nationally neutral, or it allows for the communication between speakers of other languages and fix faults in languages that already exist. Another purpose and motivation behind creating a constructed language is that they were created because, according to Michael Adams, from his book From Elvish to Klingon, there were many dissatisfactions with the linguistic state of affairs, with various social, cultural, and political changes going on, that many people just wanted to change the language because they were dissatisfied with the natural languages that already existed. Also, according to Erica Okrent, who is the writer of In the Land of Invented Languages, some conlangers invent languages in order to challenge themselves with an intellectual exercise. However, the primary motivation for inventing a new language has been to improve upon natural language, to eliminate its design flaws, or rather the flaws it has developed for lack of conscious design. Um, so I want to move on to why are get my notes together. So how did invented languages or constructed languages, how did they come about? Were they formed, through a mixture of, mashing together pre-existing natural languages, or are they kind of gibberish that somebody made up? According to Michael Adams, once again, from his book From Elvish to Klingon, the origin and development of each invented language illustrates its inventor's sense of language, what it is and what it should do in linguistic and historical terms. Each also implies its inventors and users' dissatisfactions with the languages already available to them. There are a few breakdown of different types of constructed languages. So you have, I might butcher it, you have a posteriori conlangs, which is defined by Nathan Sanders, who is a linguist and the article writer for constructed languages in the classroom. He writes a posteriori conlang is a conlang that takes a pre-existing language as input and makes one or more modifications to it. A simple a posteriori conlang can thus be constructed by taking data from a natural language and simplifying or regularizing it. So, in simple terms, yes, some conlangs are created from a mixture of pre-existing natural languages. However, there is another category of conlangs which are called a priori conlangs. And once again, according to Nathan Sanders, a priori conlangs are a conlang built from the ground up without being directly derived from an existing language. So that goes to answer the question that some conlangs are invented from pre-existing natural languages, and some of them are just completely made up from scratch. In an interview with the New York Times, and Erica Alcorant, who is the author of In the Land of Invented Languages, she states that the process people use for making constructed languages up varies a great deal. Some begin by imagining a whole world or culture and then feel they want to make a language to fill out that culture. Some begin out of a love for a natural language. The creator may love Italian or Navajo or Japanese, and they want to take the things they love about it, for example, the way it sounds, the way it creates new words, the way it encodes social roles, and riff on it artistically. Some constructed languages are philosophically curious about the relationship between language, mind, and society, and they end up drafting thought experiments to see what kind of relationships a language might theoretically capture. Some conlangers just want to come up with the most bizarre original language that they can possibly think of, and some, okay, vanishingly few, are constructed for major motion picture studios to make a language that's an artistic match for the already imagined world. So, we kind of have, a little bit of information about how constructed languages came about in a historical standpoint. We also kind of have a little toe in the water about how they're thought about in the process of being created. My next question is, how are constructed languages formed from a linguistic standpoint? According to Erica Alcorant again, she states in her New York Times interview, the structure to the process is generally followed, and the structure, unsurprisingly, is cribbed from the way people study natural languages. by focusing in on phonology, the sound system, morphology, the system for creating words, syntax, the system for creating sentences, and the lexicon, the vocabulary or the stuff that you have to memorize. Basically, constructed languages are kind of thought of in how you would think about natural languages. Constructed languages, they consist of the same components that a natural language would. They have a grammar, they have a lexicon or vocabulary, they have syntax, morphology, phonology. They have all those same linguistic features that you would think of when you associate with a natural language. Just some other things to think about with how constructed languages are formed. You kind of want to keep in mind what is the goal of your language creation. You know, what is the cultural world, you know, the people who are going to be speaking the language. Is this language going to be used for like a real life scenario? Is it going to be in a completely fictional world? Two, also, you're going to need a sound system, phonology. And you're going to need to know the basic rules for word formation, such as morphology and some vocabulary words with their meaning. Step 3, if you want to create a more extensive language, then you have to consider syntax and how you're going to string those words together, pragmatics, and even more detailed morphology and vocabulary. If you want to create a written language, that's a whole nother ball game. And then the last step is just having people to use the language. Most language makers, they begin by translating short text and kind of creating notes on how, you know, to understand their language. A lot of times, language makers will post their rough drafts of their language on the many Conlang websites that exist in the world and have other Conlangers to comment and, you know, give their feedback on, you know, what they think about the language, how they think the language could be made better, or how they, you know, based off of what the creator posts on the website, can they figure out and decode the language? They also post on wikis, which we are very familiar with wikis. But you know, wikis are basically the interactive websites where anybody who's, you know, shared within the group can, you know, interact and make changes to various features on the website. So Conlangers, they kind of have an interconnected community where they can, you know, post their ideas and have people comment on it. Another big thing with constructed languages is that there's going to be revision. Constructed languages are not just created in a day. They go through various phases of revision. So, you know, don't be intimidated that if you see a constructed language, it probably has been through many, many changes before it became what it is. As previously mentioned, just some of the components that are necessary for creating a constructed language is going to be the same as what you would consider with a natural language. Phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, semantics, all those things are present in constructed languages. So another question I kind of had was, why do constructed languages not develop into more widely used languages? According to Erica Okrent in her New York Times interview, she states that the best hope a language inventor has for survival of his or her project is to find a group of people who will use it and then hand it over and let them ruin its perfection. So in a nutshell, she just basically means that, one, you're going to want your language to get exposed to speakers who will use the language, but then you've got to, you know, let those speakers, you know, have a little, you know, variation in how they use the language. You can't be super strict on how you expect your language to be used, because obviously the speakers of the language are going to make changes. She also states, Erica Okrent, she states, for any invented language, if people are really using it, They are extending it in ways that the inventor may not have provided rules or vocabulary for. The users define the norms as they use it, and those norms have wiggle room. So basically, in a nutshell, like I just said, the users of the language are going to, make changes and variations within the language. So you can't be too strict on the rules because the speakers are going to change the way the language is used. But lastly, just another reason why constructed languages don't become widely spoken languages is because they might not have been a complete language to begin with. Some constructed languages are only, they might have some vocabulary, some syntax, some morphology, phonology, but they're not really developed enough to create conversations with. Some languages, they don't expand because they don't really have an active following of speakers for the language. So, you might have a small community of speakers, but if it doesn't expand outside that small community, then the language isn't going to get really well known. And then just for the simple fact that the language might also just have died off, there could have been a collection of people who were speaking the language and then they just stopped using it. So therefore the language didn't expand anymore because the language stopped being used. Another question: can ordinary people develop a constructed language? Absolutely. Most of the time, the people who do create constructed languages are your ordinary people who just they had an idea, they wanted to, expound on, and they created their own languages. I could do it, you could do it. There are actually Conlang linguistic courses where students can actually create their own constructed language by the end of the course. So, it's not that you have to be a linguist or an expert to create a language. You kind of just have to know the fundamentals that go into knowing how to use a language. Also, some of the people who create languages are, like I said, ordinary people, but they might be linguists who were hired to create a constructed language for like a movie or a TV film, something like that. Fun fact, the author of our textbook, Victoria Fromkin, she's actually probably considered the first professional conlanger. She was hired to create a conlang for someone else's purpose other than her own. She created the Paku language, or Pakuni, the Paku language in the TV series Land of the Lost. So she was probably actually the first conlanger to, have her work be presented in a TV show or film. Also, another question that I had, are there dialects or language variations within constructed languages? There absolutely are. There can be regional and social variations within a language. For example, as stated by David Peterson in his book, The Art of Language Invention, Shaler, which is the creator of the Volapük language, he actually resisted any attempt to change the language and insisted on maintaining complete control over its character and use. Splinter groups rose up and created knockoff versions of Volapük. So, if you're trying to be too strict with your language rules, there are going to be groups of people who disagree and they're going to, modify your language anyways, and then now you have a variation. There are variations in J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the creator of the Elvish languages. There are dialects of his language. He actually was the first conlanger to really create a family of languages. So his primary language is called Quindian, which is the tongue of all the elves, and then that major category branches off into subcategories, and the most popular dialects of Elvish that are spoken today are Sindarin and Quenya. So yeah, there is very much the possibility that there can be dialects and language variations within a constructed language. Also, in the New York Times interview with Erica Okrent, and I don't know, I think I forgot to give you the title of that interview, but it's called "Questions Answered: Invented Languages." The interviewer actually asked, you know, how do invented languages make room for pidgin or dialects of another natural language? And I think it might have been Erica Okrent or Paul Farmer. And Paul Farmer, he's actually the creator of the Navi language in Avatar. They answered that there definitely could have been dialects within the Navi language. There were other communities of the Navi people on the Pandora planet. So he didn't go that far into detail, but he's pretty certain that those other communities probably spoke a different variation than we were exposed to with the people in the movie. Let's see. Another question that I had was, how do speakers learn a constructed language? Do they study a dictionary of the language? Do they practice with other speakers? Are there manuals written? And the short answer to that is that a lot of the times they learn, speakers of constructed languages, they learn through like a manual. For the language Esperanto, there actually is a book that reinforces the rules on how to speak Esperanto. Also, the internet has contributed a great deal to the spread of Conlangs. According to this article in a book. The article's name is "The Digital Way to Spread Conlangs," and the book is titled "Language at Work: Language Learning, Discourse, and Translation Studies." With the coming of the web era in 1993, it wasn't long before conlangs started to appear on the internet. Before the web, a lang maker had to launch a conlang by publishing a book with the basic grammar, dictionary, and sample text. And nowadays, they can just upload all of that information onto the internet, and then people are able to access that information. So, in a nutshell, speakers can learn the language by studying a book, a published book, if there actually is one invented. But in today's society, most conlangs are learned from the many interconnected communities that conlangers can post their invented languages, and you can learn that way. There's also this event called the Conlang Relay. And a Conlang relay is, give me a second. Yes, okay. So, Conlang relay is basically where conlangers, the first participant, the first person, they will post their constructed language on the website, and then the next person, and it has to include like notes and things so that you can kind of transcribe and translate the language. The next participant in line has to decode that text and translate it into their own conlang, and then it goes on and on and on until it gets to the last person. And by the time it gets to the last person, the translation is totally misconstrued from what the original presenter, translated. However, conlang relays allow each participant to translate a text in another conlang, and then they're also able to teach others how to use their conlang, because as you're passing it on, you have to, use the notes from the previous person to translate their language into your own conlang. Another question. I have many questions, you guys. I didn't really know much of anything about constructed languages. One of the questions that I still haven't answered that I do want to seek an answer for is do constructed languages kind of stay amongst the fans, or why doesn't it, if there is a fan base for a constructed language, how come it doesn't really expand outside of those speakers, I guess. So as I mentioned before, there are Conlangs such as like Minionese with the Minions or Simlish with the Sims. Thousands of people play the Sims. Everybody pretty much knows about the Minions. So, why haven't those languages become a trademark of those brands instead of just like the game or the character themselves? Like, why isn't there more importance on the language? Another question. Do the speakers of a constructed language only use the language in the context or the setting of the constructed language, or do they use the language to speak of? Do they use the constructed language to speak about their regular lives? So basically, both. Speakers do talk about the context of the language. So, for example, Klingon. Speakers of Klingon, they're obviously going to talk about Star Trek things in Klingon, but the language itself has actually extended and developed so much that users of the language have created, more extended vocabulary where they can use the language outside of its cultural context. So speakers can actually, in some constructed languages, speakers can actually carry on regular conversations using the constructed language. Clearly, the speakers of the language are going to be invested in the background history and the culture and the characters of the language, but at the root of it, the language is the most important factor that they are learning. So they definitely develop it so that they can use it outside of the realms of the world that the language is used in. Let's see. Alright, so constructed languages, Hollywood, pop culture, literature. Excuse me. So as I mentioned before, I am an avid Game of Thrones watcher. And so one of the kind of crazy things that the internet has done is that it's kind of created this interconnected world of people who can amplify a minor issue into a bigger deal. So when you're watching Game of Thrones for the first time, if an actor makes a mistake, you're probably not going to notice. One, because you don't know the language, so you're probably not going to notice it. But then the thing with the internet and DVR and technology is that you can watch these episodes over and over and over. Or if it's a language that's produced in a book, you can keep reading instances and examples of that language over and over and over. So then you might start to notice inconsistencies with the language. So one of the things that the internet has done is that according to David Peterson, who is the creator of Dothraki, he says that few people, comparatively speaking, will care if an actor makes a mistake with their conlang lines, but thanks to the internet, those few people will find each other, and when they do, they'll be capable of making a big noise. So basically that goes into how vast of an interconnected community that conlangers have, and also how constructed language is used in movies and TV shows, how conlangers are actually watching consistencies within the language. So, for example, Game of Thrones, you watch the first episode and this particular word is supposed to mean dog, and then they mention dog another instance in the script, and then it's a completely different word. Conlangers are so invested that they're going to probably recognize that inconsistency. As far as constructed languages go in Hollywood and TV shows, Most of the time, con languages are going to be used in science fiction and literature and the fantasy world. That's pretty much where most examples of conlangs are being presented. But hopefully, in the future, conlangs can be used in various different, you know, realities and worlds and different genres. Um, Also, um, how do constructed languages bring people together? How do they bring linguists together? How do they bring the community of speakers together? So, the first gathering of language creators was on July the 29th, 1991. Um, that date is the first ever message. That day is the first ever message that was sent on the Conlang listserv from Boston University. So the first like major connection of conlangers were placed into a listserv, and they all received this mass email that gathered them as a community of conlangers. Um, and that happened on July 29th, 1991. Now the listserv is housed with Brown University, and that's where it's kind of permanently been for the last while. Um, so, as mentioned in David Peterson's book, The Art of Language Invention, he mentions that conlanging kind of felt like a coming out of the closet experience. We kind of know that conlanging is a hobby for some, but many times conlangers, they kind of thought their hobby was bizarre, and they kind of thought they were the only ones who were interested in inventing made up languages. But these listservs and these various conlang websites and wikis that have now been introduced, it kind of shows that conlanging is actually a lot more popular than people think. And so for conlangers, to kind of have a community that they can go to and interact with and share their ideas and thoughts, he described it as kind of a coming out of the closet experience. Like, oh wow, like I'm not the only one who's interested in this hobby. There are actually annual language creation conferences hosted by the Language Creation Society, which anyone is open to join and go see the conference and the presentations. Anybody's open to go. So that also builds a stronger network of conlangers. Conlang courses are now offered in linguistic departments. So not only are conlangs getting more exposure in the realm of it's not just a hobby. These languages actually exist in various examples and places in life. It's becoming more open to people who may not even be interested in conlanging specifically as a hobby. It could just be open to people like me who are just interested in learning about this topic that I didn't know really had this much following and this much information behind it. And as I mentioned before, there are the conlang relays. So once again, that's more of an event for people to like get their language out there and expose it to other users and speakers. And then it's also a way to translate others and provide your opinion and feedback on anybody's language. I think that the conlang community is pretty positive. They're very open about letting anybody who wants to create a language indulge in that hobby. So, I mean, once again, constructed languages not only is language a means of communication, but it has also brought society together in a way where they can share an interest in a form of linguistics that many people might have kept secret, or they didn't know they had a community to share this hobby with, that's so wide and so vast. And lastly, I kind of just want to end my research with kind of the attitudes towards conlangs. Some of the negative attitudes, according to Nathan Sanders, in his article Constructed Languages in the Classroom, He states that many linguists have long held negative attitudes towards the practice. Noam Chomsky notoriously expresses this viewpoint in a 2003 interview for the second season of second season of Da Ali G Show by telling Ali G that you can create a new language if you like, and nobody will pay the slightest attention to you because it would be just a waste of time. Um, so basically, in a nutshell, some of the negative views of Conlangs are that some people feel that it's just a waste of time. You know, you're spending too much time in a language that won't get used. What's the point? Um, there's also the question that, what's the point in creating new languages when there are endangered and dying languages that, could just be revived and revitalized? What's the point of, investing in creating a whole new language when you could just invest more in the ones that already exist? My opinion on that is, people are going to do what they want to do. They have their own interests, so I don't think that time spent on one thing is an issue with another. Like, if a person has an interest in conlanging, I don't see how that's taken away from anybody who wants to revitalize an endangered language. There's also the viewpoint that, according to David Peterson in his Art of Language Invention book, he states, parents who found their children creating languages would consider the practice so bizarre that they believed it to be indicative of some mental disorder. That's sad. Like, your kids have an interest in creating a language and you viewed it as a mental disorder. I think that goes back into why conlangers felt like this hobby of theirs was, something that they had to keep secret, or something that a lot of people didn't need to know about. And so when they found a community who shared these same interests, it felt like a coming out of the closet experience. Like, they could really be themselves and, be exposed and interested in the things that they enjoy. Some of the positive attitudes towards conlangs. Conlangs are used for creative expression. They are a form of art. It also presents a linguistic challenge for language lovers. If you're into linguistics, I think one of the greatest challenges is you having to create your own language from scratch. That's intense. Conlangs also bring language communities together. As I've shared, those who share this hobby can congregate together, whether it be in person or virtually online in these different forums and websites. And also, if you're really great at conlanging, you could have a job in Hollywood writing constructed languages for movies or for video games. So there is vitality in getting interested in being a creator of constructed languages. There is not a waste to this hobby. Those are kind of some of the major questions that I had for constructed languages. As I mentioned, I didn't really have a background about constructed languages. I knew they existed, but I didn't know anything about them. So I'm very thrilled to continue to research and, find out a little bit more about constructed languages. And I hope that outside of all my rambling, I have been able to give you some valuable information that you might not have known as well about constructed languages. Thank you.